I want to end by sharing a story with you. A story about my role model. A person who reminds me, though she's no longer alive, who reminds me time and again how important it is to be a benefit finder, what a true benefit finder is. I want to share with you the story of my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1915 in Sighet, which was then part of Romania. She was born in a lovely, ordinary, extraordinary home. She had a sister, Shindi, and 5 brothers. They were a thriving family. Her brothers were musicians, rabbis. She and Shindi were just learning how to become designers. And they lived happily until 1940, when Hitler invaded Romania. Overnight, their lives changed. They were taken, the entire family, herself, her sister, her parents, her brothers, her nephews and nieces, were all taken to concentration camp. They, alongside just about everyone else from Sighet. Elie Wiesel being one of them. They were taken to concentration camps, and in the concentration camps, they ended up in Auschwitz. My grandmother's parents were murdered. My grandmother's 5 brothers were murdered in front of her eyes. My grandmother and her sister were kept alive by the Nazis because their profession was useful to them. They could sew. The war ended. The British came to liberate Auschwitz. And my grandmother describes the groups of British soldiers walking around, and next to each group there was a doctor. And the doctor would tell the soldiers, yes, no, no. Yes, no. Yes meaning take that person, he or she is likely to survive. No meaning there's no use taking them, we may just as well leave them here because they will die. The Nazis, before they left, poisoned the food. There were many who were there who were very ill with typhus and other illnesses who were just not going to survive. And they had limited spaces in their hospitals. They could not take everyone. And the soldiers, British liberators, and the doctors came to my grandmother and her sister, the only survivors out of their family. And he looked at my grandmother and said, no. She weighed 26 kilos, 57 pounds, and my grandmother was a big woman. No. And then he looked at her sister, and he said yes, because Shindi weighed 36 kilos. And the soldiers stooped over to pick up Shindi, and Shindi understood what was going on. And she said, no. And she held on to my grandmother's wrist, to her bones, because that's all she was, skin and bones. And she held on. And the British soldiers tried to open her hand, and they couldn't. She wouldn't let go. She said, sister, sister, one of the few words she knew in English. And they tried to open her hands again, because my grandmother was not going to survive, and they didn't have place in the hospital. And my great aunt said, "No, sister, sister," and she wouldn't let go. So the doctor saw this and he said, "Fine." And they took them both, and they put them on the truck, and they took them to hospital. The doctors expected my grandmother to die within the week, but she wouldn't. She refused to die. And a month later, she put on her first gram, and the doctors talked about her coming in from different places as the miracle. Medical miracle just happened here. How could she survive when she was already on the brink of death? And yet she refused to die, and she put on more grams and more grams, and a kilo and a second kilo. And 6 months later, she could walk again. And they sent her back home to Sziget. She arrived at Sziget with her sister, too weak to walk for far, with a carriage, and the horses pulling the carriage. And there was a young man there by the name of Joseph, who saw her, and though she had no hair, and though she was still virtually skin and bones, he recognized her, because he recognized her eyes that were powerful, that were still shining, that were proud, that were not extinguished despite what she had gone through. And he recognized Goldie. And he saw her. And he hung on to the carriage with his bike. And they went to her home. And there he gave her some chocolate. She hadn't had chocolate in 5 years. And that night, they went out to watch a play together. And 2 weeks later, they were married. My grandmother became pregnant, and the child was a stillborn. My grandmother became pregnant again, and that second child was again a stillborn. It was 1948. They tried to get into what was going to become the Jewish state. They were on a boat, tried to come in without being caught, and they were caught by the British patrols. And they were sent to a camp in Cyprus with the other Jews who tried to infiltrate into what was then still the Jewish part of Palestine. They were there, and a month later, in Cyprus, in the camp, another baby was born, a baby girl. She was born in a tent, and she survived. Another month went by, and the state of Israel was declared. And they came in to Israel. The day they arrived, with a baby who is 1 month old, Joseph was taken into the army to fight against the 5 Arab armies that were trying to invade the newly formed Jewish state at the time. 2 years later, Joseph and Goldie had another baby, and that baby too was a stillborn. Goldie could have no more babies. Shindy never could have children as a result of the experiences that they had earlier on. Shindy died in 1983. My mother was like her child. We were like her grandchildren. The only child she had, the only grandchildren she had. In 1988, September, my grandmother and I went to visit Shindy's grave. At her grave, we were standing, and my grandmother was talking to her, and she was talking half in Yiddish, half in Hebrew, telling her about all the things that have happened and all the wonderful things in her life. Telling her about Talik, that's how she called me, telling them about Zevik, my brother, about Ateret, my sister, telling her about how wonderful Tzipi, my mother, was doing, and how fortunate they were. On her tombstone, there were the names of her 5 brothers and parents inscribed. And she was looking at the names. She was looking at the name of Shindi, crying and then laughing together. We were there for half an hour, just experiencing the experience. And then she said to me, let's go. Let's go home. And we walked together amidst the tombs in the cemetery just outside Tel Aviv in Holon. We walked together amidst thousands of tombs, and it was a beautiful day. There was a breeze. The sun was out. The trees were waving. And my grandmother was holding my hand. And she was holding it tight. And then she looked up at the trees. And then she followed a bird flying. It was a dove. And then she looked at me and she said, Talik, what a wonderful world. Such a pity we have to leave. What a wonderful world. Such a pity we have to leave. My grandmother experienced the worst. She saw her entire family being murdered in front of her very eyes. She gave birth to 3 stillborn babies. She endured the most hardship that is imaginable. She did not ignore the worst elements of reality. She did not ignore evil. She did not ignore the false and the bad. How could she? And yet, at the same time, she refused to ignore the good. She refused to ignore the wonderful things in the world. She refused to stop appreciating those things that make life worth living. My grandmother told me that this is a wonderful world. I believe her. Here she is, standing in the middle. My benefit finder. I'll see you tomorrow.